In truth, this fifth lecture has been the most difficult one to write. It has taken longer than any of the others to get underway. On the table, I had a fresh notebook. Sitting next to it, my pen filled with the best ink. Drawn up to the desk, my favorite chair, in which I could not sit. The words of the first sentence would not travel down my arm to my wrist and knuckles and to my fingers. The walking around the studio went on for 2 days. To justify the delay in the writing, I started making a series of lino cuts. A coffee pot on the table. Another coffee pot. Yet another coffee pot. Fat ink-wash drawings transferred to the lino block and then cut away from the lino block to make a coffee pot. I looked at the list of thoughts that I had written in preparation for the lecture. Almost all of them I have used in lectures 1 to 4. All the best ideas gone, crossed out, leaving me only with scraps. The question that started the lectures at the beginning, my father's question, anything to say, reared up. I made a lino cut of the text. "You brought this on yourself," was a line I kept on repeating to myself. I made a lino cut of the phrase. I had new Chinese brushes. I had a full bottle of Indian ink. I had an encyclopedia to disembowel and draw on. And so the notes for the lecture could be left on the table. I continued with the drawings for the lino cuts. A cat, a typewriter, peonies in a vase, a rhinoceros. Perhaps here we could actually just turn down the lights and turn up the music and just watch the slides. A lino cut with a splash of ink and a blank page in the center of the desk. What was left in the notes? There was a corner of a superannuated bestiary. The notes left read, Durer's rhinoceros, Rilke's panther, a note on cats and dogs, a bull, Picasso's goat, a return to horses, the Arsène. Now, between writing the list and writing the lecture, several months had passed. And I could not remember what was an Arsène. I looked it up in a book on African art in my studio. An Arsène is an iron disc on a pole. There are cut-out sheet metal figures and objects. The disc is about 1 foot in diameter. We have a miniature stage filled with actors and scenery, isolated from the world by the pole on which it stands. A flag, a tree, a man with a ball, a girl on a chair. As you can see, there is some similarity to a painting by Paul Klee or Jean Arp, in which a leaf can stand for a tree, and in which the radical change of scale implies a system of representation which is closer to the logics of dreams and their associations than the rationality of waking hours. The flag is higher than the banana tree. The chair is the size of the flag. Have the chair and the girl grown? Has the tree, which is now just a leaf, shrunk? Is the man next to the chair holding a ball or the moon? Perhaps both. What we do is we look at a tableau, a frozen moment of a performance, a fixed charade in which each element has a specific meaning, a hierarchy of figures and symbols and objects to convey a specific sentence or thought, a rebus waiting to be read. I read that an Arsène is a monument to a dead person. Originally from Benin on the west coast of Africa, they were made initially only for kings and the upper aristocracy as objects through which one could invoke the spirits of these dead people. But during the last century, they became common as craftsmen who usually made things for the tourist trade started using an ordinary metal and making these altarpieces to the specifications of anyone who could afford one. And there are three people in the making of an asen. There's a dead person to be honored, and then there is the donor or the commissioner of the asen who briefs the craftsman or the maker, the choice of objects on the asen, different words associated with the person being honored, his occupations, objects prized, also from words and the sounds of words of his name. And between the briefing that the donor gives and the making of the asen, there is a gap. A list of requests from the donor on the one hand, and a configuration of solutions and responses to these from the craftsman. And so the asen becomes a rebus, a text made up of the words embedded in the image, a private riddle to be read. But then time passes, and the donor joins the subject of the asen in death. He is not alive to remember the questions, the link to the craft, or to link the craftsman to the answers. The craftsman dies. The riddle remains in the museum. We lose the traces of the specific trio that contributed to the piece, the dead man, the donor, the craftsman. But the piece does not become mute. We are left with a leaf that is a tree, a flag, a girl on a chair, a ball that is a moon. And there is an invitation to make our own rebus from the elements, a narrative sentence from the different pieces. For example, we can draw a lock. We can draw a bumblebee. We can draw the number 4, a sheep, and some lips. And we can make the sentence. Lock, bee, 4, sheep, lip. But the sheep is a female sheep. So our sentence can become lock, bee, 4, you, lip. Which can become look before you leap. Or else we can read the sentence as be a sheep. Keep your lips sealed to avoid being stung. Now, this rebus is just an extension of the children's autograph book message. Why, you are, why, which you remember as too wise you are, too wise you be, I see you are too wise for me. Or else, and this one was given to me by my grandfather who gave me the book on landscape painting I referred to in the second lecture, an F-U-N, the letters as you see them, which he would read as F-U-N-E-X, S-V-F-X, F-U-N-E-M, S-V-F-M. Okay, hem and X. But alongside its meaning are the meaning's leavings, the coded letters in the graphic form, the actual objects, what's on the page, the tree, the chair, the flag, which becomes a kind of West African paper, scissors, rock. The flag covers the chair devours the tree entangles the flag. And the invitation is to make our own asen, our own translation of objects into a sentence. To make the story, to feel the possibility of extrapolation from the object. We either make it literally, folded paper, cardboard, cut metal. We take the rhinoceros, all the images from the lino cuts, put them together and make a miniature theatre in which objects can be slid about, repositioned, to make different sentences on the stage, changing subject and object. Different stories provoked by different configurations of the drawing. A massacre, or the predictions of an oracle, or a mnemonic for remembering the moons of Saturn, or a story of pomp and folly. Again, it does not actually have to be physically realized, but we are left with the possibility of making such a construction. And I walk around the studio, feeling the form of a possible asen. Dürer's rhinoceros, Rilke's panther, a tree made from a leaf, a flag, folded cardboard, folded steel. I mean, it's felt, this desire to take the elements, to make the asen is felt, it's physically felt here, in the pectoral muscles, the desire to reach out, to take the cardboard, to take the ink, to start the work of the making. an ascent of a head, a jug, and a walk around the studio as the possibilities multiply. The very not knowing the answer to the riddle opens the possibility of different answers, of different sentences. A riddle with a clear answer stops us in our tracks. Take the riddle of the Sphinx. What walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs at noon, and 3 legs in the evening? Once we answer it, the riddle is simply answered. We see an infant, we see the adult, we see the old woman. But what is left in the residue of the riddle are things such as the evocation of an entire life condensed into a single day, or the ongoing unfathomability of the Sphinx itself, the double creature, the shift between what is human and what is animal. The riddle with the answer leaves the secondary riddle of that which does not have an answer. While we think of fantastical creatures, let us consider Dürer's rhinoceros, made in 1515. As I have understood it, the rhinoceros was first sent as a gift to the King of Portugal and was sent by him to Pope Leo X. And while on the journey from Portugal to Italy, the ship carrying the rhinoceros was lost in a storm. The ship and the rhinoceros in the cage in the hold at the bottom of the sea off the coast of Italy. As a forensic record of the gift, Dürer was asked to make an image of the drowned animal. Having no model in front of him, he was reduced to making an identikit image based on reports of others who had seen the rhinoceros or had spoken to someone who had reportedly seen this animal. Somewhere behind the image was an animal. But the image is overloaded with projections of Dürer's interlocutors or Dürer's conjectures and the history of woodblock chapbooks of imagined creatures, griffins, sphinxes. And Dürer makes a woodcut rather than an engraving, the crude medium both conveying gaps in knowledge and having an emphasis on wanting to convince rather than to describe or report. The animal oscillates between being of this world, an animal observed, and coming from a completely other universe, being made more and more impossible, being familiar and becoming other. The rhinoceros, as you can see, is covered with armor plating, what appear to be rivets holding the plates of armor together. There's a secondary horn on the shoulder, like the small horn on the breastplate of men in armor taking part in jousting tournaments. A scalloped plate on its hindquarters is both a metal piece of armor and a soft skirt. But the eye looks forward, at odds with the hard carapace the body is covered with. The eye of the rhinoceros is the punctum of this image, of the other, of that which we are not. The ambiguity towards nature. This is our bestiary that we are concerned with today, our ambiguity, wanting to pull it closer, to pull nature closer towards us, while wanting to proclaim its otherness. And this is not just in Dürer. In Pietro Longhi's painting of a rhinoceros in 1751, we see the rhinoceros at a carnival in Venice. And the domestication of the rhinoceros becomes clearer. Now, this rhinoceros was Clara, who was a celebrated rhinoceros that was taken on a tour of Europe by its Leiden-based sea captain impresario between 1741 and 1751. There are 5 men, 2 women, and a child observe the rhinoceros. You can see its horn has been cut off, and one of the men holds it in his hand. And there is another rebus here, rhinoceros, horn, masks on one of the women and 4 of the men, an 18th century Venetian Asen. And we try to answer this rebus of this Asen for ourselves. So we can say the horn is a phallus. I mean, still today, rhinoceri face extinction because of this metaphor. The horn looks like a phallus, and so it is taken for one, and the compressed hair of it is ground up to make aphrodisiacs and other medicines. Now, this is not a question of art historical scholarship. This is still about gangs armed with AK-47 assault rifles to shoot the rhinoceros and to dissuade any game wardens from trying to disrupt the industry. It's about Interpol trying to intercept containers of rhino horns. There are trials of veterinarians and game wardens complicit in the trade taking place in Johannesburg as we speak. The ambiguities in Longi's painting in some way still sit strongly with us. But to go back to the ascend, to the rebus. So the power of the rhinoceros is transferred to the man holding the horn. Its potency. So is this a story of a man holding the rhinoceros horn, cuckolding the man in the center of the group with the woman standing at the back? I must confess I am not good at solving riddles, and I'm not convinced by this reading at all. But it is one of the possible interpretations of the painting. The black cloaks and the angled black hats of the men repeat the dark angularity of the animal, a Rorschach blot across the center of the picture, the dark men, the dark rhinoceros, and the wooden railing that divides the two. There's a great chain of being, another reading. Women at the top of the pyramid, distinguished by the colors of their clothes, the men already halfway to being rhino below them, then the animal, and right at the bottom, not quite the rocks and stones of a medieval chain of being, but straw and what appears to be a stone, but which I suspect is a pile of rhinoceros feces. Another reading of the rebus, 14th of February, 1751. This is what happened today. Rhinoceros near Piazza San Stefano, attended with family, then to supper. Simply a record of what was seen. The painting most probably encompasses all of these, but as with Duro's rhinoceros, the animal is both pulled towards us and pushed away. It's given a name, Clara, as though it is a family member, brought to the theater, but then marveled at for its very difference and distance. We want it to be like us, come and eat from my hand, but we need a barrier to keep it away, not from fear that it will trample us, but to reassure ourselves of its difference, of its different place in the chain of being. I mean, this domestication of nature continues. Not only in the killing of rhinoceri for their horns. I mean, in South Africa, rhinoceros are farmed like cattle. Not yet for their horns, they're still farmed for their exotic otherness. I mean, there are contradictory reversals in Johannesburg society. Game reserves with their so-called wildlife are the safest places to be in. They are holiday resorts where we can have a kind of recreational danger. I could illicitly leave the Range Rover and tease the elephant, but I don't. And at night in the rest camp there is a sleep untroubled by any sense of dangers or threats. And it's in the city that the real wildlife exists, where everyone has to look over their shoulders at a stop street. People who used to keep rhinoceri on their manicured lawns have ceased to do so, not from fear of the animals, but from fear of the men with the guns coming not to burgle the house, but to shoot the rhinoceros and to carry off its horns. And let us not deny their extraordinary otherness. I mean, we are looking at something that feels closer to a stegosaurus, something that takes us back into a far time. We are captivated by these animals, and I count myself as someone so held. I mean, there's something in the weight of that huge head, in the barrel broadness of the body, the dexterity and delicacy of movement, the crossing of one foot of another as it runs. There is a mixture of what the rhinoceros brings and what we project onto it. The lightness of its gait, as if it could be a dancer. Its connection to a deeply ancient past, more dinosaur than contemporary animal. The mass of the rhinoceros, bone, muscle, grit. How can it fill even its own volume? All its effort and strength going into becoming itself. All that embodiment tucked into a sketch pad. And of course, every rhinoceros brings with it Dura, Longi, Ionesco. Its very plates of armor weighed down with the history of expectations of what a rhinoceros is or what a rhinoceros can become. There is something inside us that reaches out towards the otherness of the animal, as if the animal itself can lead us to the unfathomable otherness that resides inside of us. A part of us we cannot reach, but which we see in the very non-humanness of the animal. We anthropomorphize the animal, not to say it is like us, but to get closer to that part of it and of us that we cannot reach. What is a horse? Girl number 20, define horse. Girl number 20 thrown into greatest alarm by this request. This is Charles Dickens in chapter 2 of Hard Times. The interrogator is the school owner, the platonic Mr. Gradgrind. Girl number 20, unable to define horse. Blitzer, define a horse. Quadruped, gramnivorous, 40 teeth, namely 24 grinders, 4 eye teeth, 12 incisors. Sheds coat in spring in marshy countries, sheds hoofs too, hoofs hard, but requiring to be shod in iron, age known by marks in its mouth. This and more, Blitzer. Now, girl, number 20, said Mr. Gradgrind, you know what a horse is. Quadruped, tail and mane. That is enough to draw a horse. But a horse is also exactly the right scale for the magnification of a man, for making him magnificent. A man standing on a table or a chair is ridiculous, but on a pedestal, we begin to let him grow. But put the man on a horse and hopefully the horse on a pedestal, and you have a hero or a tyrant, or at any rate someone who has made a name for himself. A horse also fits so snugly under the legs. It is not just connected to the person, but part of him, an extension of the person to show who he really is. We both make the horse part of us, an attribute or demonstration of our own might. The horse becomes an anthropomorphic prop. But more than that, we absorb the horseness into ourselves. An uprightness of posture, from Marcus Aurelius on the Campidoglio in Rome, to Verrocchio's mercenary Bartolomeo Colleone in Venice, the eye of the horse and the eye of the condottiero, to Simon Bolivar in Central Park. Being a man is not enough. Being a rhinoceros is not enough. For Marshal Zhukov on his horse outside the Kremlin in Moscow, even sitting on the horse is not enough. He stands in the stirrups, a child on tiptoe playing at riding. The ghosts of Don Quixote and Rocinante follow them all. We suck in the energy and strength of the horse, then sit up straight to show that you are worthy of this transfer of power. Through our posture, convincing the horse of our divine right to ride him. In Italo Svevo's Confessions of Zeno, Zeno, recently married, reflects on his new state. He realized he was so contented in his new role that he found himself assuming the pose of the different equestrian statues he had seen in the squares of the towns he had visited on his honeymoon. The Huinem-like moral goodness of the horse is transferred through a demand of posture, the horse as a teacher of deportment, to the man even when the horse, the founding principle of the action, is gone. This is like Cockney rhyming slang in which the explanatory term disappears, leaving only the verbal effect. Your feet in Cockney rhyming slang are plates of meat, meat and feet rhyming. But then we don't say plates of meat to refer to our feet. We only say plates, as in, I must get off my plates, or my plates are killing me. As if the asen maker is gone, we don't know the meat. All we know now is the uncomfortableness of walking on plates, the care we have to take as we walk. The horse has been consigned to the knacker's yard, but we keep the posture. In the studio, this need and not need, this reduction and extrapolation is there in the physical transformation of objects. So the horse could become a series of jointed paper pieces, or 4 sticks and a door handle, trying to bring the heroics of the horse down to a tabletop level, to take away its authority. But it is not possible. You have simply a broomstick and a stuffed sock, and on top of this hobby horse, every child becomes another Marcus Aurelius. Now, a cat is a line and a dog is a dot. The principle of a cat is its spine. You draw any line, you add some fur, some ears and whiskers, and you have a cat. But a dog is its nose, its movement being led by its nose, a point leading the way, an arrow, at best a vector across a page. Now, in working with puppets, you can take a feather boa, you can put a tennis ball at one end and 2 sticks to support and manipulate the boa, and you have a cat. It can rub against you, it can sidle up, it can turn in on itself. You can shake one hand and the thighs of the cat twitch, ready for a leap. For a dog, you need a head to indicate direction of the nose and a tail to comment on the nose's findings. Now, we can pull our cat and dog further. We do not need to make puppets of them, but we can let them inform the performance of an actor. A performance incorporating catness into the body, into the voice, into the movement of an actor. And it becomes a performance of indifference. Fill an actor with a dog, and however hard he tries, there is a residual stupidity. A whole reading of Waiting for Godot could be done with this cat and this dog. Cat, nothing to be done. Dog, I'm beginning to come round to that view myself. All my life, I've put it from me saying, Vladimir, be reasonable. I mean, or in Antonio from Merchant of Venice, in sooth, I know not why I am so sad, it wearies me, the cat says. Or in The Seagull, Medvedev, the dog, why do you always wear black? Masha, the cat, I'm in mourning for my life. There's a circling of lines as they twist, the cat gently turning. I mean, we could in truth do it the other way around. Switch Vladimir and Estragon, both could work. In any event, what it is about is taking an attribute from outside of ourselves, catness, dogness, something we can observe, something we can become expert in, and absorbing it. It is outside of us, but it corresponds to something inside of us, which we hope it will attach to make clearer. There's also a reverse transmogrification. The Irish writer Flann O'Brien, in his book, The Third Policeman, here he talks of metamorphosis, but not of animals. The gross and net result of it is that people who spend most of their natural lives riding on bicycles over the rocky roadsteads of this parish get their personalities mixed up with the personalities of their bicycles as a result of interchanging atoms with them. And you would be surprised at the number of people in these parts who are nearly half people and half bicycles. When a man lets things go so far that he is more than half a bicycle, you will not see him as much, because he spends a lot of his time leaning with one elbow on walls, or standing propped up by one foot on curbstones. This transmutation of atoms we see in yet another bicycle. Picasso's bull. Bicycle seat and handlebar switch atoms in both directions. The bicycle becomes a bull. The desiccated skull and horns of a dead bull, ears gone, hide turned into the hard leather of the saddle. But the bull also retreats into the bicycle. We make the other familiar. The duende of the bull squeezed into the rally 28-inch bicycle in order to reinvigorate the quotidian. The lees, the residue of the metaphor, the skeleton of the bicycle filled with new possibilities. Another domestic scrapyard, Picasso's goat. Here we have not one transformation, but a series of them that altogether constitute the goat. A life made of scrap, found objects, everything that can be consumed. A basket eaten becomes ribs. A plumbing pipe swallowed becomes the anus. Ceramic jugs become udders. A palm frond becomes the slope of the goat's back. A small palm frond for the snout. All held together with plaster. turned into an absence, the mold, transformed into wax, and then transformed into bronze. But what holds us here is not just recognition, the bicycle bars like horns, the saddle like a skull, but with the goat we have a gathering of potential, a meeting between the strengthening of the image of the nanny goat and the element found in the scrapyard next to Picasso's studio at Vallauris. We see the chaos combining, the work of transformation. We are learning the grammar of the goat. And we see it through that which is not transformed, the plaster that holds the elements together and completes the sculpture. The sculpture is a demonstration of the action of making the world. We have the goat, which is the sum of everything it has consumed, palm fronds, basket, and this omnivore now repeated, now demonstrated in the sculpture. We think of Picasso making the goat. He's thinking of height, the width of the shoulders, the size of the hoof, the palm frond turning into hips. He's deep in the making. But of course we see more than just this making. We see the goat, to be sure, but we also see a sense in which the world can be constructed. The ad hoc of fragments that fly in towards us, and taking these fragments to make our own Asen. We run the film in reverse. We see the goat. We see the constituent parts now separated, sitting in the studio. We see them dispersed amongst the debris in the scrapyard. Picasso carefully placing each in the camouflage of different objects and shards in the garden, in the refuse, in the abandoned bicycles. We run it forward again quickly, and we see the whirlwind as the pieces gather, spin round and form into the goat. That makes from such chaos this goat. Not a beast slouching towards Bethlehem to be born again, but standing foursquare in front of us, ready for anything that lies ahead. Now, transformation, metamorphosis, is of course the bread and butter of animation in the studio. Something difficult to do on the studio, in the stage, to turn a cat into a telephone, gets called together by the cloth, the paper, the charcoal, the eraser. We have a disintegration, things rubbed out, a possibility of anything arriving, a potential, everything turned into potential, and then a landing as something else. When she was about 3 years old, I told my daughter Alice a story. Once upon a time, there was a dog and a cat, and they were in the garden. And the cat was teasing the dog. The dog chased the cat, and the cat ran through the cat flap into the kitchen and escaped the dog. Later that day, Anne, my wife, asked Alice what the story was that I had told her, and she repeated the story. There was a cat and there was a dog in the garden, and the dog chased the cat, and the cat flapped his wings and escaped. Now, here it is all offered. The concept of cat flap was not comprehended and was replaced with the flap, the familiar flap of wings. The story is understood. The cat and the dog in the garden, the chase, then there's a garbled section, a piece of text missing, and then the escape. A pressure not to accept the broken bridge, the word not understood, a narrative need, more than a narrative need, a demand for comprehension. A demand to put the fragments together into a whole, to turn the cat into a griffin, to reach its escape. To respond to a crisis with an imaginative transformation. For the cat, the crisis of being chased by the dog, and for Alice, the crisis of not understanding the particular word. Now, this is Ovid. Tereus' wife and sister are fleeing from him. Tereus chases them through the rooms of the palace. They are in a panic of escape. This is Ovid in the voice of Ted Hughes. He saw the sisters running. Now his bellow was homicidal as it was anguished. He came after them, and they who had been running seemed to be flying. And suddenly they were flying. One swerved on a wing into the forest. The other, with blood still on her breast, flew up under the eaves of the palace. And Tereus, charging blind in his delirium of grief and vengeance, no longer caring what happened, he too was suddenly flying. On his head and shoulders a crest of feathers. Instead of his sword, a long curved beak. He had become a wood hoopoe. Alice did not specify the type of bird the cat had become. It was a generic griffin. Here is a later example. I was speaking on the telephone to a friend, Basil, and I asked him what his husband, Adrian, was busy with. Oh, he said, Adrian is making a tree search. A tree search. Now, of course, a tree search is an internet term. You search for a word for the trunk, and from this flow many branches which you can follow to smaller and smaller branches and twigs, refining the search until you find the information on your particular branch. Or leaving that branch, returning to the trunk and following another branch. You can zoom out and see the branch you are on and its relationship to all the other facets of information, all the other parts of the tree. A tree search. At the end of the conversation, I asked Basil what Adrian was researching. What do you mean? You said he was doing a tree search. No, he said. I said he was making a T-shirt. Now, a tree search is less interesting than a griffin, but let us follow it. For the first instant, I was stopped by not knowing what it was. I felt stupid. I didn't know a tree search. But almost at the same time, I saw and constructed the principles of a tree search. Even as I saw the tree inside me, it was as if it had always been there. Even as I grew the tree inside me, I could envisage it on the computer screen, the drawing of the tree, the blocks of text on the branches, and I cursed myself for not knowing immediately what it was. Now, on the one hand, this is a super ego caring for us, protecting us from revealing our own ignorance, performing as if we knew what we were talking about. But it is more than that, even if only as a byproduct, as a result of the self-protective thinking. The need for making sense of the world by all means possible, of using whatever pieces we can find in the scrap heap. A computer screen, a photo of a tree, a diagram of a flowchart, fragments of a text to complete the sense of the world. To follow the route map again of where we have arrived at this stage. We've come from Plato, we've arrived in Africa in the colonies, we've come down to Johannesburg in Africa, then in the last lecture specifically into the studio in Johannesburg. And now we are with Ovid, Flann O'Brien, Rilke, in the bookshelf on the studio, looking at images and words, looking at the productivity of mistranslation. The Panther at the Jardin des Plantes, Rainer Maria Rilke, Paris, 1907. Ceaselessly the bars and rails keep passing, till his gaze from weariness let all things go. For it seems to him the world consists of bars and railings, and beyond them the world exists no more. Supple, strong, elastic is his pacing, and its circle much too narrow for a leap. Like a dance of strength around a center where a mighty will was put to sleep. Yet from time to time, the pupil's curtain rises silently. An image enters, flies through the limb's intensive stillness, until entering the very heart, it dies. Now, the poem, as you see, is in German, which I do not have. And I only know the poem in translation. In this case, the one I read by Richard Exner. And so, of course, the poem multiplies. There is no correct translation. Only a series of circling the poem of what it might be in English. Every translation is a mistranslation. The German poem has very specific, precise rhyme and rhythm. Stäbe hält, Geber Welt, Schritte dreht, Mitte steht. Pupille hinein, stille zu sein. The English translations that try to keep to this rhyme scheme exactly have to mangle the language so thoroughly that to get the rhymes to sound, that is all we hear and the poem disappears. And versions that try to keep to a completely accurate English equivalence for each word also lose their sense of being in the English language. The version I have just read I cut out of a New Yorker magazine in 1984. It was the first time I had come across the poem, which for me, and I'm sure for many others who read it for the first time, is a revelation. And I do not literally carry this piece of paper folded in my wallet, but a photostat of this poem, which was in fact from an article by George Steiner about Rilke, has been in my studio since 1984, together with newspaper cuttings, a photo of refugees in Burundi, a page from an encyclopedia showing how a bird flaps its wings, Chilembwe's letter, The Voice of Africans in the Present War, the last few pages of Mayakovsky's play, A Tragedy. All of them are in the studio collected in a file labeled Important, Not to Lose. Since then, I have read many different translations, but the first one that I came across still seems the best. I mean, there are many, many translations of the Panther, enough to make a whole Panther translation convention. And one could make an argument for each line why it seems to him the world consists of bars and railings, and beyond them the world exists no more, is better than it seemed to him that 1,000 of bars are before him, and behind them nothing merely. Or it seems to him there are 1,000 bars, and behind the bars no world. I could explain why I think the midline rhyme of it seems to him the world consists of bars and the world exists no more in the next line propel us into a rhythm of walking like the Panther, and so on. It would be a justification after the event. The particularity of private opinion always appears as an objective description of the world, that this translation is better. It is as if there is a Platonic judge adjudicating objectively from his place in his sun the best, the second, the fourth best translation. Now, there is, of course, a close relationship of some words to the images. Welt does mean world. Tanz is a dance. But very soon we are in a shifting, moving place. The Vorhang der Pupille is sometimes a curtain, a shutter, a film. The Tanz von Kraft is sometimes a dance of strength, or a ritual dance, or a particular dance. This is the first level of dislocation. We are back at the anamorphic cylindrical mirror, making a distorted translation in the sheet of paper below to try to see the original Panther in the mirror above. The dislocation of the translation, the imperfect art of making a distorted mark, a new version on the paper below the mirror, so that its reflection is similar to the German poem. In the mirror, you want to see nur manchmal streibt der Vorhang der Pupille sich lautlos auf, as the poet writes. And on the sheet below, you try out just now and then the pupil's noiseless shutter is lifted, or only sometimes when the pupil's film is soundlessly lifted, or you try, yet at times all noiseless the pupil seems unveiled. Only sometimes does the shutter of his pupil's door slide open. Just sometimes lifts the curtain of his sensing up soundlessly. Only at times the curtain of the pupil lifts quietly. Only sometimes when the pupil's film soundlessly opens. Some sound more euphonious than others. Sometimes the effort of translation comes too much to the front. But as with the anamorphic mirror, there is another level of transformation in the translation. The original poem is fixed. The translation has double the distance than the mirror. the shift and variation that the translators make, and the way we alter the image in the mirror by changing our relationship to the mirror itself, where it is always personal, always autobiographical. Now, I first saw the poem with the precise lines in English that I read to you in 1984, and it felt as if those lines were written specifically for me. It was as if I had been waiting for those lines. They were like the advice you only hear when you already know what is going to be told. The sense that lines fit into a space that has opened up for them. So one thinks, how can a poet writing in Paris in 1907 have such a sense of who I am in Johannesburg in 1984? A point of connection. Now, in the poem there's an anthropomorphism and there is a reverse anthropomorphism. The panther does not so much become a person as a camera, and we become the shutter out of alignment so that all we see is the shutter and not the world behind us. The world consists of the shutter, and that's all. The turning of the film reel, the pacing of the panther. And finally on film, the film-like image that goes down the reels through the body of the panther, traversing the reel of film. It shudders through the tense stillness of the limbs to the heart and disappears. It disappears into darkness, like underexposed film, becoming all dark, or into the white blankness of overexposure, but at any rate an image held and then lost into the dark cave of the center of the panther. But this very anthropomorphism, of human-machine morphism, is there to bring us out of ourselves, to that part of ourselves that we don't know, to the center we cannot grasp, the center where the will stands paralytically, the center where a mighty will is put to sleep. What caught me when I read the poem in 1984 was not the description of the panther as a camera or photographer, but the two lines, like a dance of strength around a center where a mighty will was put to sleep. They corresponded so closely to what it felt like to be in the studio. The urge to make something, a gathering of energy around what? A blank page, the empty paper, an energy gathered but not knowing what it must do. The impulse to make something, to paint, to draw something, but waiting for a clear instruction. What is to be done? What are the images to be made? As if the instruction would tell me, we are waiting to make a proletarian revolution. We are waiting to come out of the cave into the sun. While the only thing I had confidence in was the very circling itself, the riddle that had no clear answer. The riddle that has a clear answer, that has certainty, as with every clear answer, always needs a loaded rifle, a policeman to protect the image, and also to keep it in order. In the studio, this manifested itself in the split between an energy of tensing of the muscles, right here. You can almost taste it, like taste buds, energy of the work to be done. A split between this energy and a lassitude, an inability to keep awake that would sometimes come over me, a defense of sleeping, an inability to know what should be made, or how to make, or why it should be made, masquerading as tiredness. A real tiredness masking a fake tiredness. The need and not need to make something. It's not as if there's a particular image I'm burning to make, or a story or experience I need to tell. This is the not need. But the pressure for something to gather the energy, that is the need. Now, Rilke wrote the poem The Panther when he was working as a secretary for the sculptor Auguste Rodin. And he was stuck with the what of writing, knowing he was a poet and not knowing what the words should describe. So Rodin sent him to the zoo with the instructions not to come back until he had written about something he had seen. I mean, this is one of the great poems of the last century. It started life as a homework exercise. But the relief in the poem, in the relief of recognizing yourself, what had seemed a fault, a mistake, a moral weakness, this falling asleep at the job. There was an exhaustion in which I would look at what I had spent drawing in the morning, and then I would sit down at his chair at the back of the studio to look at it, and then I'd close one eye to squint at it to try to get it to change, and then I'd close the other eye to squint at it, and then I'd close both eyes, trying through an act of will to improve what was there in front of me. This closing both eyes and then drifting off with the mantra, let this time pass, let this time pass. But reading the poem, the fault was passed back into the world. This is how it is. This is what we see in the Panther. The split between energy, possibility, and the gap. The sleep in the body or the blank paper in the studio, and then the writing of the poem. The making of the drawing, the filling the studio with them. Their presence on the walls, in the gallery, in the museum, a dance around a center. The magnet of the poem, that it should stay in the studio these 27 years, partly connecting to the charcoal blackness of the Panther, meeting the thought of drawing halfway. A panther, God in the charcoal dust, the pacing and the gap. The meeting on the paper, the membrane between what is us and what is outside of us. What we can comprehend and the animal unconscious unknowingness that sits inside us. Here is not just a distant sending of signals from the outside world to us, but something that pulls the two together. The Panther in Paris, the studio in Johannesburg, meeting on the page. The Panther changed to words to meet the projection from the outside world that is waiting for us. For the mix of energy, the certainty of desire, and the radical hollow at the center of it. Thank you.